gentlemen, you guys are excited. You've got to be excited because it's time to learn some information about ancient Rome. And I'm Mr. Reitman, along with...
I'm Mr. Plaza.
Hey, Mr. Vici.
And we're ready for part one, the Republic.
Now let's start off talking about the essential questions. How does where you live affect who you are? Also, what makes change desirable? How do people respond to this change? And how does a leader rise to power? And how does he or she hold on to it? And also, what are desirable leadership traits?
These questions and more will be answered in the next 10 minutes. Okay, now that is the mythological version. The more historical version that we will point to in this class deals with a group of people called the Latins. Okay, and they moved to Italy in the mid-700s, and we consider the Latins to be the first Romans, the earliest Romans. They built the first settlements on Palatine Hill. So again, even though that Romulus and Remus story is kind of mythology, that Palatine Hill idea is still there. In the late 600s BC, a people called the Etruscans took over. And actually, these people brought a lot of stuff to what would eventually be Rome. The Romans that lived there, those old Latins, adopted the written language of the Etruscans. They crafted jewelry and fine clothing. And they created paved roads and sewers that the Romans eventually used in their own empire. Now, eventually, Etruscans, who were ruled by tyrants for the most part, these tyrants were overthrown. And as a result of that, Rome grew into a prosperous society with a republic, and this is a really key term here, that power rests with the citizens to choose their leaders.
And we had two different groups in society. The first group that we're going to talk about this afternoon is the patricians. Now, the patricians were a very small amount of the population, but they were small and mighty because they were powerful landowners. They controlled the government, sort of how, like, the three of us control our classrooms. At least we hope so. They inherited their power, but they could also serve as judges. So they had a lot of power, even though they were very small in number. Now to take you into the second section of society, the plebeians, here's Mr. DeVici.
With the plebeians, they made up most of the population. But they were mostly farmers, workers, artisans. And these plebeians had a few rights. They couldn't hold public office. They were not allowed to be in the army. And they could not know the Roman laws.
That seems so unfair.
So unfair.
It's really a shame. So what happened was these two groups had a conflict, and we call it the conflict of the orders. And what happened was, in the late 400s BC, the plebeians started to strike and demand more rights from the patricians. And as a result of this, they gained the right to hold office and join the army. Now you might be asking yourself, how in the world did they do this? Well, with a strike, the purpose of that is to stop working so that nothing gets done. And the patricians started to realize that they needed the plebeians to get things done in the society. And so they pretty much gave in to whatever the plebeians wanted. So as a result of this conflict of orders, the plebeians gained these two rights they did not have before. And they also forced the government to write down the laws. Now this seems kind of like a simple idea, but before this, in Rome, there was no such thing as a written law. Basically, the rulers could enforce whatever laws that they wanted, and people didn't even know, a lot of times, that what they were doing was illegal. But as a result of this, with the government writing down these laws, people knew exactly what was expected of them and what the punishments were. We call these first written laws the 12 Tables. And you can probably guess, there were 12 tables, 12 different ideas of the law that were written down on these tablets and carved into the wall. And then as a result of this, the distinction between patricians and plebeians was not as important.
Now, you may think that economic turmoil is referring to 2013 United States. However, it also referred to Roman times as well. There was a growing gap between the rich and poor. Slaves made up of 1/3 of their population, so for every 3 people, one of them was a slave. Small farmers were forced to sell land and became homeless. 1/4 of the population was urban poor. Unbelievable. Huge amounts of people out of work.
However, let's get to the Gracchi brothers. Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. And those two guys at the top are a good picture of them. Now, Tiberius was elected tribune in 133 BC. What he did is land reforms made him popular with the common people. He was very pro-plebeian, okay? And he was elected by the plebeians, and these senators hated the reforms that these two brothers came up with. And eventually, they were clubbed to death by senators and supporters. The whole idea was it went against the senators because it took away land, because he tried giving more to the plebeians. And Gaius was elected tribune in 123 BC. And what he did is he sold grain to the poor for low prices. But this angered the Senate. And eventually Gaius was killed in a riot by the Senate. Now this whole idea, it set a precedent that if people didn't like the rulers, they could overthrow them and kill them.
Right, and we'll get into more detail about what a tribune is, who the senators were, but as long as you understand the idea that the senators were rich and the Gracchi brothers looked out for the poor, and that's why they kind of clashed, then you should be fine for right now.
Now, a very popular name that you need to be aware of, and most of you know this already, is Julius Caesar. No, not the guy that made a salad. No, no, no. It's the nephew of Marius. He was popular, very popular general among the poor and the troops. He looked out for both groups very, very well. And he was a very powerful public speaker, just like Mr. Plaza is in your classes.
Give me a break. All right, so Caesar actually did not rule alone. He was actually part of a group called a triumvirate. Okay, and the term triumvirate means rule of three, so basically three people in charge. And in 60 BC, this first triumvirate, we call it in Roman history, consisted of Caesar, a guy named Pompey, and a guy named Crassus. And these three guys were the three that were supposed to share the power in ancient Rome.
Wait, Mr. Plaza, do you want to explain Pompey and Crassus, what area they were a part of, so they got all three?
Right, so all three of these guys are very wealthy Romans. Pompey was actually another general in the Roman army. Crassus was a very wealthy Roman who took part in a lot of the politics that took place in the city. And so these three guys were the most powerful people in Rome. We call them a triumvirate, so rule of three. The prefix tri meaning three. Okay, Caesar became something called a consul in 59 BC, and again, we'll get into more detail what this terms mean. But basically, he brought all of a place called Gaul under Roman rule, so it expanded the territory in a huge way. Now, eventually, Crassus died in battle. Okay, he was killed, so it left Rome with two rulers, Caesar and Pompey. Now, again, both of these guys are very powerful generals, and so, of course, they're going to fight. In 52 BC, Pompey, who actually went back to Rome, ordered Caesar to bring his army back to Rome he ordered Caesar back without his army, Caesar refused and said that doesn't make any sense because he knew that Pompey was going to try to get rid of him because Pompey wanted to be the only ruler. Marched his army back to Rome, and on January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar, a Roman, actually declared war on his own country, declared war on Rome. Caesar defeated Pompey, and in 44 BC, the Senate declared Caesar a dictator for life. Now, a dictator in Rome was only supposed to serve for 6 months, but Caesar became so powerful that they declared him dictator for life.
In a couple of the reforms that Caesar had, he granted Roman citizenship to people in provinces. He expanded the Senate with friends and supporters. He also created jobs through construction. He gave plebeians money. He gave them chances to make and create money for their families. And he also increased the pay for soldiers so that more people would want to become part of their army.
What a good guy, Mr. Raymond.
Beware. Beware the Ides of March. Senators were starting to fear that dear Julius Caesar was getting a little too popular. So what happened? On March 15th, 44 BC, was the Ides of March, to live forever and beyond. At the Senate, both Cassius and Brutus stabbed Caesar to death. What were the results? You'll learn more about this in future units. So, for Mr. DeVici and Mr. Plaza, I'm Mr. Reitman. Hope you guys learned something. Get some knowledge from ancient Rome, and have a great day. So long, everybody.
Adios!
Later.